What defines a sinister ritual? Well, when it comes to the Victorian era, they had quite a few that today we would be surprised we still sort of do now. Hi, my name is Jessa, and please join me as we look together our top 10 sinister rituals from the Victorian era you can't unlearn. Oh, and before we begin, in the last video I was in, the top 10 hygienic practices in ancient history that made no sense, I gave you guys a riddle. Did you get it? The riddle was, what are 2 things you can never eat for breakfast? The answer is, drumroll please, it was lunch and dinner. Your next riddle will be at the end of this video. Anyways, let's get started. Number 10, hair forever. We'll touch a bit on the subject of death as it was a very constant subject in the Victorian era, and when it comes to parting with loved ones, it was difficult for practically everyone. And as talented as craftsmanship goes, when it comes to making jewelry, they also had the impulse to create decorative pieces like rings, brooches, bracelets, and wreaths all out of human hair. According to the Smithsonian, some men would wear watches, fobs made out of their wives' hairs, and women would keep clippings of their friends' hair in scrapbooks. To those in the Victorian era, hair jewelry and wreaths were a way to show your connection to someone who had died, but they could also be a way to show your connection to a living friend, child, or spouse. Women of the 19th century would swap locks of hair as a love token the way young girls today might wear friendship bracelets. Another reason is due to the fact that unlike many other natural materials, human hair does not decay with the passing of time, and I guess for modern fashion materials, it's a good note to have. Number 9, saying cheese. When it comes to death, we're lucky if we have photos of our loved ones while they were still alive, but when photography was still in its infancy, in an era before people could quickly travel for funerals, post-mortem portraits served as a record for family and friends who could not attend. Photos were mostly of children and young adults who could not have had their images captured prior to their untimely death. Portrait sessions would often involve posing and staging the body with props that presented and represented the deceased's hobbies and interests. Some images, especially tintypes and ambrotypes, have a rosy tint added to the cheeks of the corpse. Later photographs show the subject in a coffin, sometimes with a large group of funeral attendees. In Victorian England, they became a way of commemorating the dead and bluntly the sharpness of grief. While some can find it to be immoral, for others it is important to do so before they have buried someone they loved. Number 8, walk walk fashion baby. Mourning clothes were a must, and when Queen Victoria lost her husband Albert, she dressed in full mourning for the first 3 years. To her death, it was unusual to see her in anything but black, but her example led to the population copying her style of dress. And certain expectations were set in place. Mourning clothes were considered an outward expression of a person's inner feelings, and societal rules were especially specific for women in deep mourning. Women's clothing were deep in black and non-reflective, often trimmed in black crepe and worn in minimal or no jewelry. Additionally, widows were expected to wear black silks and weeping veils across their face, or a widow cape or widow cap. After a specific time, a woman moved into mourning where colors were like gray and lavender were permitted with minimal design. For men, fashion was a lot more easier as they simply wore dark suits and black gloves, hat, bands, and cravats. Children were not expected to wear mourning clothes, and for those who were wealthy, servants even wore mourning clothes. If you didn't know what to wear, they had a household guide that helped one to understand the societal etiquette as it was essential for these times. Number 7, time after time. Alongside the subject, it was essential you were to mourn for a specific amount of time. Like the previous number, Queen Victoria had worn mourning clothes for 3 years. In the Victorian era, society observed a specific mourning period as a proper etiquette. The length of the time depended on the type of loss for the spouse, sibling, parent, child, or cousin, etc. For example, widows were expected to wear mourning clothes for 2 years, 1 year in full mourning and 1 year in half mourning. In addition to wearing only black during the deep mourning, a widow could not go out in society except to attend church. The rules for men were a lot less strict due to the fact it was expected that a man would remarry shortly after his spouses had passed away, or his spouse. For children, if they lost their parents, it was for 1 year. For grandparents and siblings, it was 6 months, and for other relatives like your uncle or aunt, it was 2 months or a specific amount of weeks. While there were set rules on how long you must outwardly mourn, there was no necessarily set end date. In this era, there was no hurry to end a period of grief, as people took the time they needed and those around them respected the necessities of mourning. In the words of the Queen Charlotte from Bridgerton, sorrows, sorrows, prayers. Number 6, superstitions. During this time, humanity was still learning a lot about the natural world, and people who were spiritual and believed in the supernatural. Because of this viewpoint, there was a number of superstitions surrounding death. Victorians carried the deceased out of their home feet first so they couldn't look back and call someone else to follow them. Curtains were closed and mirrors were covered until after the funeral so that the deceased image wouldn't get trapped in the looking glass. It was thought that you might be next if you saw yourself in a mirror at a house where someone had recently died, and to prevent bad luck, all clocks were stopped at the time of the death. And somewhat creepily, Victorians turned family photographs face down to protect family and friends from possessions of the spirit of the dead. Number 5. Grave robbery. It was very common for grave robbing to exist at this time as the medical world was becoming more and more determined to advance. But these advancements needed one thing above all else's: corpses. This profession was also known as body snatchers, and grave robbers would wait until the family would leave the cemetery and get to work before the rot sets in. Doctors would pay good money for the freshest of corpse to advance their anatomical knowledge, so with that in mind, these grave robbers would become a major concern for everyone. As well, in some cases, even with medical still in its early stages, some medical conditions weren't as well understood. So a doctor might mistakenly declare someone dead. In these cases, this person was just often in a coma. To combat grave robbers and premature burial due to lack of medical understanding, the Victorians put a few safeguards into place. Some families buried a loved ones with a rope in their hand attached to a bell outside the grave, so if the person in the grave woke up, they could ring the bell signaling that they needed help. Other burial options included bricking over a grave, covering it with a protective gate, or purchasing a coffin with a series of tubes and mirrors to allow the grave diggers to peer inside for movement. Number 4. Predetermined. The Victorians had no illusions about death. Mortality rates for children was quite high, and even if you survived childhood, many adults didn't live past 50 years old. In this era, death was so certain that people prized an elaborate funeral service. Because of this, many families saved for years to pay for funeral services. In fact, women frequently made their own shrouds, including them in their own weddings. In our modern day and age, we don't commonly talk about death as those in the Victorian era, but if anything, it does teach us that it's okay to talk about or even plan for death. As the Victorians didn't focus much on death itself, they did accept it as a reality and planned it for a while. While their methods seem strange to us today, the Victorians did understand the value of celebrating a loved one's life and honoring their memory. We could greatly benefit from more openness and less fear, and a willingness to have these important conversations with our families. Number 3. Taxidermy. The Victorian era folk had a general obsession with stuffing animals. What began as a few plums of herons and jays and pheasants tucked into the brims of lady hats, it became widely popular as a trend which the fashion industry capitalized on by going to the extreme, adding entire taxidermied birds to tall hats, as well as stuffed hummingbirds to decorative hand fans. The fashion trend took a truly bizarre turn in the 1880s when the hat crowns grew tall, offering a generous display area for, in the most extreme examples, an extraordinary array of animals including cats and squirrels. Even in some cases outside of the fashion, they'd have taxidermied everything and enjoyed practicing their own skills on a variety of deceased species and often combining them in death. Walter Potter, who was a famous English taxidermist, was known for creating an anthropomorphic dioramas like a rabbit school. Number 2. Who will it be? Although it was shunned in the 16th to the 17th century for one to do witchcraft, but in the Victorian era, it was actually the age of the great illusionist, as optical projection and magic tricks could be found within the sleight of hand shown on variety and theatrical bills on the fairground magic and illusion shows, where it became a staple diet of Victorian entertainment. Illusionists and spiritualists were popular attractions in the Victorian theaters and exhibitions, and in their halls, audience could sit amazed as ghosts appeared on stage and automata solved mathematical puzzles. Renowned performers appeared to levitate, slice the heads off of spectators, and escape out of locked boxes, and even famous magicians, as you know, like Houdini, would be as an example. Even for young women, it was common for them to play a little game like seeing if they could see one's future spouse from a crackling fire, fortune tellers, and tarot cards. Number 1. Freak shows. When you think about the circus or the carnivals, you might think of fun and games to play, horses and tassels, and fun ringleaders that would entertain the audiences. However, the origins of these fun events do have a sinister history of mockery and torment of those who look different, or at the very least make them look different. Freak shows were a particularly popular form of entertainment during the Victorian period, when people from all classes flocked to gawp at the unusual examples of human life. The shows were viewed as a suitable amusement for the middle class and were profitable for the showmen, who exploited the freak show performers' disabilities for profit. Changing attitudes about physical differences led to the decline of the freak shows as a form of entertainment towards the end of the 19th century. Of course, Ringling Brothers were far from the only circus to offer a freak show to curious audiences across America, but it was one of the most famous alongside the Burnham and Bailey circuses, and the two circuses would eventually merge. When Queen Victoria saw a show herself, she and her guests were spellbounded by the performances and even wrote in her diary with great curiosity she had ever seen. Without realizing it, she had given the freak show her royal seal of approval. So, who was your favorite, and did you learn anything interesting today? Let me know. And your next riddle is, are you ready? What has many teeth but cannot bite? Be sure to put your answer in the comments below and I'll reveal the answer in the next one. Top 10 horrible jobs medieval peasants were forced to have. That's all for today. Thank you for joining me. My name is Jessa. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see your beautiful faces in the next one. Bye!